Hi there, this is Utkarsh Jain, and purpose of this video presentation is to cover reading 16 of CFA level 1. The reading covers basic introduction to a financial product called as derivative. Now, the best way to understand derivative is, rather than going by textbook definition, we would try to understand this through a small example. So now let us say that there is one particular popular restaurant in your city, and the owner of this restaurant is worried for some reason. Now what the owner says is that he's got a menu card where he puts the prices of his dishes, and there's one particular dish that he's got where, let's say, which is being sold for 50. Now what he says is that one of the major ingredients that goes into making this dish, let us say, is potatoes. Now what he says is that the price of these potatoes keeps on changing in the market. So when he goes to buy them, he might be able to buy these at 20 rupees per kg, or he might be able to buy them at 25 rupees per kg, and therefore price of these potatoes would keep on changing in the market. Whereas the price at which he sells his dish cannot be changed every week, and therefore his profits margin are being variable every week. So now what he says is that, is there any way which I can use which would help me remove this uncertainty from my business? So now let us say that this particular gentleman that we have, his name is Mr. Shetty. Okay, so let's say that this is how Mr. Shetty looks. This is Mr. Shetty. Mr. Shetty does is that he goes and meets a local farmer. Alright, so this is how a farmer is going to look like. This is the farmer here. Now, what Mr. Shetty says to Mr. Farmer is that you need to sell your potatoes, the potatoes that you produce, and even the price at which you would be able to sell them is not sure, because the price would depend on when your final product is ready and you want to sell it in the market. So now what we can do is, let's say that your next lot of production of potatoes would come in 3 months, and I need to make my purchase 3 months from today. So no matter what the price of potatoes in the market 3 months from today exists, we will get into a transaction where I will be able to buy these potatoes from you, and you will be able to sell these potatoes, let's say, at a predetermined price, and they negotiate this price in advance. Let's say that they keep this as rupees 25 per kg. So now what is the term of the contract? What Mr. Shetty says is that after 3 months from today, so let's document this, 3 months, Mr. Shetty will be able to buy, let us say, 1000 kgs of potatoes from Mr. Farmer at the rate of rupees 25 per kg, irrespective of what the price of these potatoes is in the market. And then, to avoid future problems, they decide that they wanted to have these terms and conditions written on a document, and they put all those clauses there. And of course now this document would be called as a contract or an agreement. So now what happens after 3 months is, let us say that price of the potatoes in the market turns out to be rupees 30 per kg. Now suddenly Mr. Shetty feels that he did the right thing by entering into the contract, because this contract now will help him purchase all these potatoes at rupees 25 per kg, and therefore his benefit in that case, when the price is 30, Mr. Shetty's benefit is 5,000 rupees on the entire contract, 1,000 into 5. Whereas what farmers would say is that if I wouldn't have entered into the contract, I could have sold my potatoes at 30. But because I have entered into the contract, I'll have to sell them at a lesser price, and therefore I'm incurring a loss of 5,000. Let's assume a scenario now that price actually turns out to be rupees 40. Now what Mr. Shetty would say is that if I would not have entered into the contract, I could have bought them at 40 rupees. But because of this contract, I can buy them at substantially cheaper price. So it's benefiting me 15 rupees per kg. So for me, it's worth 15,000. Whereas farmer would say that I have an opportunity loss here, and the amount of loss is 15,000. Let's say that price, this is scenario number 1, this is scenario number 2. Let's say scenario number 3, that price in the market actually turns out to be only 10 rupees per kg. Now what Mr. Shetty would say is that if I would not have entered into the contract, I could have bought these potatoes only at rupees 10 per kg, but because of this contract I will be required to buy them at 25, so my loss is minus 15,000, whereas the benefit of now the farmer is that now he can sell them at a higher price. So farmer's benefit on this contract is 15,000. So now what we can clearly observe here is that as the price of potatoes is changing in the market, if it's 40, the benefit to both the parties is changing. So now, as the price of potatoes is changing in the market, the price of this contract, the price of this piece of paper is changing, and this is precisely what is called as a derivative contract. So what is derivative? Derivative is an asset. It's a financial instrument which derives its value based on the value of, avoiding the terminology, some other assets. That means in this case potatoes, that as the price of potatoes is changing, the price of this piece of paper is changing. So this is what precisely derivatives is. So let's say if we have two assets, asset A and asset B, and as the price of asset B changes, it is going to impact the price of asset A, then we will say that asset A is the derivative of asset B. And now within derivative there are various types. This is the first category of derivatives, which is called as a forward contract. So what is a forward contract? Forward contract is essentially a contract between two parties. In this case we had Mr. Shetty here, we had Mr. Shetty, and we had Mr. Farmer. So now the person or the party which says that it intends to buy in future, that party is said to be long on the derivative. And the party that says that it intends to sell in future, that party is said to be short on the contract. So Mr. Shetty is long because he promises to buy potatoes, and Mr. Farmer is short because he promises to sell potatoes. Now what they plan to sell in future, that means in this case potatoes. So this potatoes is the asset based on which the prices of this piece of paper was changing. Therefore this potatoes is called as the underlying asset of the contract. So in this case the underlying asset is potatoes. In real life scenario you would see that underlying assets might be commodities, it might be equity, it might be bullions, it might be gold. So underlying asset can be anything, but essentially the price of this piece of paper is changing on potatoes. For this contract, underlying asset is potatoes. 3 months was the time which they had pre-decided for the transaction. So this 3 month is called as the maturity of the contract. 1000 is called as the contract quantity, and 25 is called as the contract price. So now if I have to redefine the derivative is a financial instrument which derives its value based on the value of underlying asset. And now we are done with the first type of derivative, which was called as forward contract, where two parties essentially entered into an agreement to buy or sell something in future, and the asset which was decided to be bought and sold in future, that was called as underlying asset. So as the price of underlying asset changed into the market, the price of the piece of paper, that means the derivative contract, that means the forward contract in our example, kept on changing. Now let us say that problem of Mr. Shetty was resolved by entering into these forward contracts, which at least helped him know at what price he will be able to buy these potatoes in a month's time or 2 months time. Now imagine a scenario where we have thousands and thousands of restaurant owners in this country, and similarly thousands of potato producers. So in that case, all of them would have similar concerns, all of them would like to remove this uncertainty. So now one of the institution identifies an opportunity. So this is the institution here. What it says is that all those farmers who intend to sell their potatoes, those people can directly contact me. And all the Shetties who intend to buy these potatoes, these guys can again contact me directly. What I will do is I will act as a party in between, which would try to match the request to sell of this party with the request to buy of this particular party. Now they actually started doing this business, and they realized that there were certain difficulties in the process. So now what were those difficulties? Number one, there was this particular gentleman, a restaurant owner, who said that he wanted to purchase a quantity of 1020 kgs of potatoes, whereas one particular farmer said that he wanted to sell 970 kgs of potatoes. Again, and both of them wanted to do it in 3 months. There was one particular farmer who wanted to buy 1000 kgs of potato, and there was one particular restaurant owner who wanted to buy 1000 kgs, and one farmer wanted to sell 1000 kgs. But this Shetty or this restaurant owner wanted to do it in 2 months and 10 days, whereas this particular farmer wanted to sell this after 3 months. So what this institution realizes that there would be thousands of people trying to buy and sell, and if you allow them to create contracts as per their own wishes, then matching them would become really difficult. And the only solution to overcome this problem was to standardize. So what does it mean? It means that now this institution came up with a set of rules. Rule number one, that the maturity of the contracts will be fixed. It would be 1 month, 2 month, 3 month or 6 months. These are just examples. So if someone wants to buy or sell, instead of telling the institution at what time he will like to do it, he will have to choose between these. So that particular restaurant owner or farmer would be able to choose between 1 month contract, 2 month contract, 3 month contract or 6 month contract. Second, that even the quantity needs to be standardized. So now quantity would be, let's say, in the lots of 100. So what it means is that in this case, if this particular restaurant owner needs to buy 1020, he can either buy 10 contracts, which will let him buy 1000 quantity, or he can buy 11 contracts, which will let him buy 1100 quantity. If someone wants to sell 970, he can sell either 9 contracts or 10 contracts, but he will not be able to sell 970. So now, see what is happening is it's essentially the same contract, but now there is some amount of customization, some amount of standardization which has been done into it, and the same standardized forward contract now would be called as the future contract. So what are futures? Futures are essentially a forward contract, but then since these futures are bought and sold through an institution which is also called as an exchange, this institution is called as an exchange, and therefore these are required to be more standardized. Now see, this process went on for some time, and then an event or an incident happened. So now what happened is that after the standardization, there was a particular restaurant owner here, and there was a particular farmer here. Now this restaurant owner requested to buy 10 contracts and farmer requested to sell 10 contracts. The contract price was fixed at 30. Now all these requests were made in an electronic format. This restaurant owner, let's again call it as Mr. Shetty, and this farmer never really know that who was the other party to the contract. So typically in the world of finance, we call the other party into the contract as counterparty. So the restaurant owner did not know who was the counterparty, and so was the case with the farmer. Now, on the date of the maturity, that is after 3 months, the actual price of the potatoes in the market turned out to be 12 rupees per kg. The price is reduced drastically. So ideally what it means is that in this case farmer is being benefited because he is being able to sell it at a higher price. But then what Mr. Shetty simply said is he refused to execute the terms of the contract. Mr. Shetty said, or the restaurant owner said, that now he do not want to execute the contract. So now what happens is, in the earlier case when it was a forward contract, Mr. Shetty and Mr. Farmer knew each other. So if one of them failed to execute the contract, they could always go to the court and sue each other. But now, in this case, since farmer did not know who the other party was, farmer decided to sue the institution. And then what the institution thought was that this was a significant problem because in future there might be more number of people who would default on the contract, and then it would be the institution which would be prosecuted all the time. So what they decided to do now is, in order to save against this default risk, they asked both the parties that before one could enter the contract, he would be required to pay some amount of security deposit. Now what this security deposit will be calculated in such a fashion that in case if there is a default, this security deposit would be more than sufficient to give profits to the other party. So now the same forward contract repackaged and rebundled into a more standardized fashion with given some security features now has become the next type of derivative, which is future contract. So now if you have to find out the differences between forwards and future, let's make a nice list of it. That these are our forwards, this is a future. The first major difference is that these contracts will be called as customized. Meaning of customization is that when two parties meet each other, they can decide the place of delivery, they can decide what date, they can decide the price, they can decide the quantity, whereas future contracts were more standardized. The second major difference is that forward contracts are called as OTC contracts. OTC means over the counter. And what over the counter means is that when two people sit together and they get to negotiate the terms of the contract, then these are called as the contracts which are signed over the counter. Whereas the future contract, these are required to be bought and sold through that institution, and therefore these contracts would be called as standardized contract. The third major difference is that to enter the forward contract, there was no security deposit that was required. Whereas to enter the future contract, the parties had to pay security deposit. So these security deposits, in the terms of derivative, in the language of derivative contracts, would be typically called as margins. So to enter into a forward contract, no margin amount is required, whereas to enter into a future contract, parties are required to pay these margin amounts, which are nothing but the security deposits. And then fourth major difference is, but because there is no security deposit, there is always this risk of default. So default risk exists with the forward contract, whereas in case of future, since the security deposit is already given to the institution, in case if there is a default, that loss would be made good using the security deposit. Therefore, there is no default risk that exists in case of future contract. So these are the larger differences of between the forward contract and future contract. Now when we do these topics individually, so there are separate readings that we have on forward and futures, then we would discuss more about them. Now moving on to the next topic. Now let us assume that Mr. Shetty has got really seasoned into this idea of signing either forward contract or future contract with various farmers. Now what he realizes is that, let us say I sign a contract of 25 rupees, where in 3 months time I will be able to buy potatoes at 25. If the price in the market is 30, 35, 40, anything above 25, I am benefited from this contract because I get to buy these potatoes at a cheaper price. But if the price in the market is 10, 15 or 20, then in a way I lose on these contracts or lose on this contract, because I could have bought these potatoes at the market prices of 10, 15, 20, but I will be forced to buy these potatoes at 25. So what he thinks is that, can I get farmer to sign a contract where all my benefits would exist as per the terms of the contract, but if I am in a situation where it is disadvantageous to me, I should be allowed to simply throw off that piece of paper. So what it means? What it means that if I can get farmer to sign a contract where again 25 is the price, let's say again 1000 is the quantity and 3 months is the maturity, but I would just put one clause extra, that Mr. Shetty will execute this contract only and only if this contract benefits him, otherwise he would not be forced to execute the contract. So now let's think from farmer's perspective. So what it means is, now let's say that after 3 months the price in the market turns out to be 30. Then Mr. Shetty will definitely execute the contract because he's benefited by 5 rupees. He can buy it at a cheaper price. If the price in the market turns out to be, let us say 40, Mr. Shetty will execute the contract. But after 3 months, if the price in the market turns out to be, let us say 15 rupees, then what Mr. Shetty will do is he will simply throw off this piece of paper and he will not be required to execute the contract, which means that he will not be forced to buy at 25. He will be able to buy at 15 rupees, which would be the market price of the contract in that tenure. So now let's think from the farmer's perspective. Now farmer entered into a contract because what he knew is that if the price of potatoes in the market is less than 25, then at least he will get to sell these potatoes at 25. Of course, if the price in the market is 30 and 40, then farmer stands to lose, because without the contract he would have sold at 40, but with the contract he's being able to sell only at 25. But now with this new contract, when the price in the market is 50, when actually this contract is supposed to help the farmer, Mr. Shetty will simply throw off this piece of paper. That means this particular new contract, which is only one-sided now, is benefiting only Mr. Shetty. It is not benefiting farmer in any way. Now, obviously, farmer would not agree to sign a contract like this. What he would say is that this contract is not benefiting me in any way, so therefore I do not want to sign this contract. So what Mr. Shetty now does is he tries to convince him. And in order to convince him, what he says is that I will pay you, let us say, 1000 rupees as a compensation to make you sign this contract. So irrespective of what the price of the potatoes is in the market 3 months from now, you will get to have, you can keep this 1000 rupees. If I execute this contract, that means if I decide to buy, I will still pay you 25,000. I will not set off this 1000 against your 25. But if I decide to simply not execute the contract, what you get to keep is 1000 rupees without really doing anything. Right? So now in this case, farmer is tempted to probably take this 1000 rupees and assume that level of risk. And now the next type of contract that we have, which is now in a way one-sided and it's tilted towards Mr. Shetty, these type of contracts is called as option contracts. Now within options there are two types, but we don't want to go to them as of now. But what you need to understand from a larger perspective is that this is a contract where one party compensates to the other party, and this compensation in option language is called as option premium. That Mr. Shetty paid 1000 rupees of premium to Mr. Farmer. He gets to keep this 1000 irrespective of whether the contract is executed or not. And now, since Mr. Shetty in this case has got a right to buy potatoes in future, this is the first type of option which is called as a call option. But we don't have to worry too much about the terminology. We just want to understand at this stage a larger picture, that a call option would give right to one person to buy an asset in future, and he would buy only and only if it benefits him. Had this been a future contract, even when the price was 15, Mr. Shetty would have been forced to buy potatoes at 25. But when this is an option contract, Mr. Shetty will not be forced to buy potatoes at 25. He will simply throw off the piece of paper, and if he needs, he can go and buy potatoes at 15 rupees per kg. So now we would move on to the next type of derivative contract, to which we will call this as swaps. Now the best way to understand swaps is think of them as some sort of an exchange contract. So what is an exchange? Let's say that we have these two gentlemen here. This is Mr. A and Mr. B. Both of them have portfolio of 1 lakh rupee. But what Mr. A decided is that he said that I want to invest my money into fixed deposit of a bank, let's say, which offers him 10% per annum. Mr. B decided that he wanted to invest this money into equity securities, and the return would depend on how the equity securities behave. Now, after a few years, what Mr. A thinks is that Mr. B is very smart. Ideally, even I should have invested my money into equity. Whereas what Mr. B thinks is that Mr. A is very smart. At least he gets to earn 10% per annum. Whereas my returns are variable. I do not know what amount I might be earning. In fact, I might lose as well. So what they decided to do is they decided that instead of selling my or liquidating my fixed deposit and then investing into equity, and instead of selling my stocks and investing into fixed deposit, why not swap the returns with each other? So what it means is, let's say that the agreement is signed for 3 years. They sign a simple agreement that whatever returns that Mr. A will earn, he will give it to B, and whatever returns Mr. B will earn, he will give it to A. And this agreement is signed for 3 years. So now in year 1, Mr. A will earn obviously 10% on 1,10,000. Let's say that Mr. B actually earned 14,000 on this equity security. So now Mr. B will be required to give 14,000 rupees to A, and A will be required to give 10,000 rupees to B, which means the net effect is that B will be required to give 4,000 rupees to Mr. A. So this contract is typically called as a swap contract, where two parties decide to exchange the returns with each other. Right? So now these are the derivatives that you have to, these are the derivative products that you have to study in level 1. Let's quickly summarize all of these. So derivatives are financial instruments, and these derivatives derive the value based on the value of underlying asset. Okay. And within derivatives, we saw that there were 4 major types required for CFA level 1. The first one were forward contract. It is essentially a contract where one party agrees to buy, the other party agrees to sell, and then the price is predetermined. And these contracts, what we know is customized, where two parties meet each other and then they sign the contract. Therefore, we also call them as OTC contract. Then the next type of derivative that we saw were future contracts. Futures were nothing but a more advanced version of forwards. It was the same forward contract which was more standardized in nature, and this was traded through exchange. So people could buy and sell these contracts through exchange. And another major important was that there was some amount of security deposit that was to be given, which was called as margin money. The next type of derivative that we saw was options. And what we saw was that these are one-sided, where one party at its will might decide to execute or not to execute this contract. And in order to get that right to decide, it would pay some compensation to the other party, which we called as option premium. And the last type of derivative contract that we saw was swap, where there's some amount of exchange that was involved by two parties. So this was a small introduction of the entire derivatives that we have to go through CFA level 1. Of course, we will have to study them quite in depth and know the features of each one of them. But for the purpose of this particular reading, this level of broader understanding is sufficient. So now we will meet in the next reading, which would be dedicated towards understanding the forward contracts and their mechanism. This is Utkarsh Jain. Thank you for your time.